Hi, my name's Simon Murray, and this is just a quick video to address some of the questions regarding Autoair Colors paint reduction. The Autoair Colors line has undergone a lot of reformulations and improvements since it was first introduced. A big formula change occurred in 2007 when we changed the resin or the binder. And because of this, the paint lays down a lot flatter, less cratering, it dries quicker, and has better flow. And subsequently, we no longer have to use reducer, particularly for 1.2, 1.3 larger spray guns. But before we look at the spray gun, we're going to look at how to set up the airline. The first thing we have to understand is the difference between line pressure and consumption. Now, current US legislation states that you must not spray above 35 psi. In Europe, we spray around 40. But if you look at my gauge here, you'll see I'm setting about 43, 44 psi. However, this is line pressure. When I pull my trigger, you see the gauge drops. This is consumption. So at Autoair, when we talk about spraying at 35 psi, we mean when the gun is actually consuming air. So again, you'll see my gauge drop here, and that is consumption. And now we're back onto line pressure. So I'm just going to adjust the gauge. And you notice when I turn the valve, nothing happens. It's wildly inaccurate. It's only when I consume air that the gauge becomes accurate, and you see now it's adjusting perfectly. So I've set my gauge at about 35 psi, and I'm ready to start spraying. Just going to have a quick look at gun setup here. The first valve I look at is the air adjustment valve. Now I've just set the air to 35 psi, so I can largely override this valve. I just keep it wide open. And the next valve I'm going to look at is the fan adjustment valve. This determines the size of the fan on the gun. You see when I screw it in, the paint becomes a lot more directional. So I'm just going to screw it back out again, giving me a wider fan. And the last valve I'm going to look at now is the fluid adjustment valve. This determines how much paint comes out of the gun. It's completely independent of air. So you see when I screw the valve in, the trigger does not move as far back. And you see now that I've screwed it right in, it's just air coming out of the gun. This is now single stage. However, whenever I pull the trigger back, then the paint comes out. Before I show you what to do, it's probably better to show you what not to do. So I'm starting off with transparent paint, which is a notoriously thin paint. And I'm taking some transparent yellow. And into this, I'm going to mix about approximately 20% reduction. So that's transparent paint with about 20% reduction. And I'm just going to use a DeVilbiss GTI 1.3 spray gun. No surprises what's about to happen here. And you see the paint is flowing very, very quickly, soaking wet, massive amount of atomization, and largely uncontrollable. We've all seen this before. You can see the craters, the pigment migration. Next, we're going to look at the other side of the spectrum. I'm going to use an SRI 0.8, and I'm taking some metallic gold. Now, the metallic paints are obviously a lot thicker than the transparents, and subsequently need a little bit more reduction. But here, I'm spraying with my 0.8 with zero reduction, and for good measure, I've just dropped my air pressure down to 20 psi. And you can see, even at full throttle, the paint's hardly coming out of the gun. This is painful. If you were to try and paint a car or a motorbike with this, you would die of old age, okay? This is the complete opposite to atomization. You see how streaky the paint's gone on? And what this is going to do is give me a very, very rough, textured surface. Very orange peely and very floaty. And you can just see how streaky it is there. So now we know what not to do. Let's have a look at doing it right. I'm just going to take some semi-opaque straight out of the bottle here, and I'm putting this into a 1.2 spray gun. This is deep purple, semi-opaque, 1.2 spray gun at 40 psi. 35, 40 psi, you're not going to notice much difference in the paint's performance, and you can see immediately the level of atomization and how quickly the paint is laying down. Now, please don't confuse modeling with under atomization. When you see the panel here, it looks a little bit mottled. That's just basically because I haven't reached full coverage. This paint is perfectly well atomized, I just haven't reached coverage yet. Obviously, as I start to put second and third coats on, the paint is going to reach its sealing coat. So again, I'm coming in now with my second coat. And on my second coat, I'm probably going to be looking for somewhere in the region of approximately 80% coverage. And again, I stress this is with zero reduction. And you can see the paint is starting to lay out a lot better now, a lot flatter. Still a little bit mottled there where it hasn't covered, so I'm going to come in now with my third and final coat. Just using a tack rag to remove any surface imperfections. And I'm just laying down that last coat, probably only about 20% away from complete opacity here. When the third and final coat is on, you can just see the finish, silky smooth, real satin, very, very flat surface. Next gun I'm going to look at here is a SATA RP3000, 1.3 setup, 35 psi, zero reduction, and I'm just using deep black here, putting it straight into my gun, and I'm laying down 3 nice light coats. I've just masked this panel up with 1-inch masking tape. Haven't even used fine line tape here. This is just traditional 1-inch masking tape. And even with 3 coats with a 1.3 spray gun, you can see I've got zero paint creep. Pretty impressive for a big gun. What I'm going to do now is spray the other side of the panel, exactly the same scenario. However, this time I've put in about 10 or 15% 40-11 reduction, same air pressure. Watch what happens now whenever I remove the masking tape. And you can see I have not achieved the same result. And under close inspection, you can see I've incurred quite a lot of paint creep underneath there. And again, this is another reason why you possibly would not want to use any reduction, especially if you're doing a lot of graphics with the larger spray gun. The next thing I want to talk about is something that is often overlooked, and that is the temperature of your paint. Now, I'm working in a downdraft spray booth here, however I'm also spraying in Ireland, and it gets bloody cold here in the winter. So if you're in Canada or Northern Europe and your paint is really cold in the winter, well then that is going to affect how much reducer you have to use. I'm just setting my spray booth at 22 degrees Celsius. Now that is a comfortable room temperature. However, if you're working in your shed at night time and it's really cold in the winter, you might want to warm your paint a little bit. Now please, I am absolutely not recommending you store your paint long term on a radiator. However, just 15-20 minutes on a radiator will increase the flow rate of your paint drastically. Another thing you can do is just put it into a vessel here, obviously not plastic. I'm just using a steel cup here. I'm putting my paint in. I'm using a heat gun for about half a minute just to warm the paint slightly. But as I said, I'm spraying about 22 degrees Celsius here, so I'm comfortable, my paint's comfortable, and there's really no need for a reduction. So I'm using a DeVilbiss SRI 0.8 setup at 35 psi, and I'm just shooting the paint straight out of the bottle. Building it up over 2 or 3 light coats. My third coat will reach complete coverage. And now I'm ready for my next colour, which is transparent fire red. What I'm going to do is a fade. I'm going to fade the red into the yellow. Now I've just used semi-opaque without reduction. I'm using exactly the same setup. The transparent paint is now going to be reduced. Doesn't make a big pile of sense. However, this is necessary when you're doing fades. When you want to fade 2 colours, the second colour must always be heavily reduced. But before I can do this, I must set my gun up. So I'm screwing my fluid adjustment valve right in and just backing it off about 1.5 turns. This is really just damage limitation here. And I'm adjusting my fan. And now I'm ready to start spraying. So you see I'm being pretty reckless here. I'm squeezing the trigger as hard as I possibly can. But because I've got that gun set up, because I've got the fluid adjustment valve screwed right in, giving me a massive air to paint ratio, nothing can go wrong. So even though I'm full throttle here, there's tiny amounts of paint coming out. And this way, when we do need to reduce our paint heavily, by setting the gun up, we can control it. So I'm making multiple passes, but I'm not suffering from the pigment migration that I did on the first panel I showed you. Takes a little bit of patience working to this mentality, but eventually you can just build the paint up over and over again. I'm literally on 80, 85, maybe 90 passes here, and it's taking that just to get the coverage. But the only way you can get a 2-colour fade like this is to have your paint heavily reduced, which is fine as long as we know how to set the gun up. And you can just see the panel is fading from red into orange into yellow. The next color I'm using here is semi-opaque dark green. Now you've just seen me use semi-opaque flame yellow with zero reduction, and yet with the same setup I'm now going to put about 5% reduction into the dark green. Why? Well, the reason is even within one particular line like the semi-opaques, you're going to get slight viscosity differences. Now I'm using an Iwata W300 here, and as I say, about 35-40 psi, and you see with that 5 or 10% reduction, you'll notice that my first coat behaves exactly the same and looks identical, the same degree of atomization as the semi-opaque flame yellow without reduction. So it's going to take a little bit of practice, a little bit of experimenting for to get your head around this. But here's the general summary. If I'm spraying with the big guns, typically 1.2, 1.3, on large areas like motorcycles or gas tanks or complete cars, I use absolutely zero reduction. Just squeeze the bottle, squeeze the trigger. You see how quickly this paint's laying down? I guarantee you this is the most effective way that you can use the Autoair paint. This is Base Coat Sealer Dark. And over the top of that, I'm just laying down the metallic gold that I used earlier. And again, no reduction whatsoever. You can see the paint just lays down so flat, it's got better flow, dries really quickly, with absolutely no cratering whatsoever. Just going to have a quick look here at some airbrush reduction ratios. I'm not going to dwell on this too much because we've got a real nice video by Terry Hill specifically on airbrush reduction on our website. But this is transparent smoke black, just straight out of the bottle, and I'm using an Iwata HPBCS. That's a 0.5 suction feed airbrush, and even though it's only out of the bottle, you can see I'm getting some pretty decent lines there. This is how I use most of my paint, straight out of the bottle, especially if I'm using semi-opaques and transparents. Everything you see here is completely neat, unreduced, at 40 psi with a 0.5 airbrush. Even a lot of the backgrounds here, I was using the 0.8 spray gun, but again, no need for reduction. The background grade outs and even the ceiling was all done with the minigun, and the artwork was done with the airbrush. I've taken the transparent smoke black and I've reduced it by about 50 or 60%, and you can see immediately the flow rate is a lot faster, higher degree of atomization, and the paint is a lot more responsive. Now, if I was using a smaller airbrush, it's a simple equation. I'm going to have to reduce the paint a lot more. But for the 0.5, this is probably working out just about fine for me here. You can see these are reasonable lines. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to reduce the paint by another 100%. And you can see I'm starting to really push my luck now. The paint's starting to break, it's spidering a lot. That's telling me that my air pressure is too high and my paint is too thin. I don't really want to drop my air pressure too much. I have a better scenario. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put transparent base 4004, and I'm going to put about 20% transparent base into the same mixture. I could of course just thicken it with more black paint and drop my air pressure, but this is a quick and accurate fix for me. Just by putting that little bit of transparent base in, you see the paint becomes a lot more responsive. So as you can see, the whole process is really about trial and error. If you're not getting detail with the airbrush, if it's a little bit grainy and heavy, chances are your paint is too thick. Your air pressure might also be too low. However, if the paint is spidering on you, your paint is probably too thin and your air pressure possibly too high. But if you check out the website, autoaircolors.com, you'll see loads of information and tech support. And if you check out my website, smdesigns.co.uk, you'll see some other videos there. My name's Simon Murray. Thanks very much for watching.